Good morning or afternoon. Welcome to FSMA Fridays. My name is Jill Bender, VP Marketing with Safety Chain Software. I'm delighted to all those that are logging in and joining us. For March, we are continuing the discussion on Listeria. It was quite a bit of information that was shared in our last session. The guidance documents had just come out, and there were a lot more questions to be addressed and nuances that I'm delighted the TAG team today will continue to share with us. With today's call, I'm delighted, of course, to have Peyman on, always with us with the TAG team. Welcome. Good morning.
Good morning, Jill. Good to be with you again, and good morning, everybody.
Also delighted we're talking about how we're initiating Randy Porter into the FSMA Fridays Club, but certainly is someone with the Acheson Group for, gosh, it sounds like about a year and a half now, and brings 30 years of experience in food safety. I was quite impressed, Randy, reading your bio. In fact, you worked with Nabisco, Conagra, and Campbell, to name a few. But welcome to FSMA Fridays. Delighted you could join us.
Thank you, Jill. I'm looking forward to my first time in FSMA Fridays, and hello to everybody that's out there listening in.
Excellent. We'll try to go easy. I think we'll put the hardest questions to Randy. How's that sound today? Before we get started, just a few housekeeping tips. As always, we do record this session, and everyone that has registered and joining us today as well will get an access to that link. If you do have any questions, I've seen one that's already been submitted. You can do that online. For those that are calling in, you'll just have to listen in, but you have to be logged in to actually do a call. And again, as always, for everyone's privacy, you should be only able to see the panelists with us today. But as always, I see lots of people logging in and calling in, but let's go ahead and get started. So share with us, Peyman, tell us what's new on the FSMA front.
Sure, Jill. Good to be with everybody again. Not a whole lot happening other than the sanitary transport rule. The compliance deadline is coming up on April 6th. And as we've talked in the past, it's one that perhaps a lot of the components of it are already in place, but it's really forcing the companies to take a look at the roles and responsibility of various players within the transport chain. Are you a shipper, are you a loader, a carrier, a receiver, and what are the roles, and what does your relationship and the documentation say? And then do you require them to do additional activities, or the amount of verification work and responsibility that are currently delegated to each entity is sufficient? So it's forcing the companies to kind of take a look at their relationships and the agreements that they have in place within their supply chain. So that's one. And literally right before our call, I saw an email come through from the FDA that looks like they've issued a guidance that are formally recognizing the DUNS number, the Data Universal Numbering System number, for using as part of the foreign supplier verification activity. So I haven't read it yet, but it's a guidance there. There's a link, and I would encourage those that are interested to visit the site and take a look at it. So those are the couple that probably came to mind. As always, we're kind of monitoring what is going on in terms of the budgets, approvals of the new administration, and so far what we've seen is that food safety is more or less left alone. The budgets haven't been cut, and FSMA is, as we expect, is going to be alive and well moving forward. How much funding is allocated to the FDA is still up for discussion, but in terms of the regulations, at least in place, if folks are interested, that things are still moving forward. So that's my brief update on the FSMA side.
Okay, great. It seems the new administration and what the crystal ball is, it seems to be peppered into these conversations quite a bit, and we'll look forward to having the updates and hot off the presses on the other areas too.
Right.
Well, great. Well, why don't we go ahead and dive in then? And as mentioned, we've extended the conversation on Listeria only because there are so many questions that came out of our last topic. But I also noticed that just the preponderance of a number of recalls related to Listeria. I'm just curious before we dive into some of the questions, your thoughts on that, as far as is there more of a cadence of these recalls, and why is that?
There is, and I'll ask Randy to weigh in on this as well, but there certainly has been a increase, and part of it has to do with technologies that are being used, the whole genome sequencing, better data management, and linking perhaps individual independent events into larger issues and more visible issues. Those folks are looking more, they're reporting more, and of course the guidance is really driving a lot of that. Is people taking a look at it. Of course, guidance hasn't led to any additional recalls per se. That's not what we're saying, but rather it's one that's it's forcing companies, and which is what we're talking about, is take a look at their current programs and how does that align, or at least compare with the guidance documents that came out. So it's definitely a worthy discussion, and it certainly generated a lot of questions from last month's discussion. So, Randy, do you want to add anything to this one?
Well, I guess the only thing I would add is that, in the world we live in today with social media and the media itself, anytime there is an issue, clearly that's communicated almost instantly. So the awareness is also much, much greater today than maybe it was several years ago. But otherwise, I would agree with your comments.
Certainly, everything is more out there, isn't it? So that makes sense. Thank you. I appreciate that. Threw sort of a last-minute question at you before some of the other questions we have going. Well, let's go ahead and dive in. Again, some of these questions did come in during our last session, a couple new ones as well. And if you are online with us, go ahead and put any questions in the Q&A tab as we're going along. So I'll go ahead and ask you to address our first question. If you are testing for various species on food contact surface, what are the best practices for holding shipping products while awaiting your lab results?
That's a great question that came up, and I'm sure it arose from the discussion around that free pass from the initial test that was included in the guidance document for Listeria ready-to-eat foods. And I agree with what David said last time, in that if you're conducting any type of testing on a food contact surface and you're not putting the food on hold, then you're taking a risk there, because you might have to, as part of the follow-up and corrective actions, if you get a positive and just the investigation, realize that maybe there is a bigger issue, and so a lot of that product may have to come back. And the guidance left the free pass in there to allow people to better accept, perhaps, the guidance. And I say guidance is not a law, so it's entirely up to the companies, but at least kind of make it easier for companies and individuals to implement a more robust environmental monitoring program. The issue is, if you do let the product go out in the market from the first test, you conduct, and you even have a positive, you conduct corrective actions, a root cause analysis, and down the road you have another one, and maybe in a fairly close time point. Then what's going to happen is now you have to potentially bring that product that you shipped out after the first test back. So it puts the companies at a bit of a risk there. So my recommendation is do what essentially folks have always done, is if you're doing food contact surface testing, keep the product on hold until you get the results. That may be the easiest way to manage it. Of course, there's the logistics component of it. There is the management of the warehouse, the production, and everything else that goes with it. But from a brand exposure and regulatory risk standpoint, I think it's probably the most prudent thing to do, is just hold on to the product until you get the results.
I know it seems to make sense, certainly. I know the cost or the different components around it always makes it challenging, but no, thank you for that. Moving on to the next question, and Randy, I'll go ahead and ask you to answer or join us here. Is there an acceptable level of positives for Listeria species, such as zone 3 and 4?
Well, you'd like to say that, you know, the goal is certainly 0, but that's not reality. Because Listeria is so ubiquitous in the environment and in the facilities, if you have a facility that has a product mix and or has a wet environment, cold storage environment, certainly you're at a much higher risk to have positives that show up in your environmental program. You know, the document talks to understanding the effectiveness of your program. And if you have all 0s, your program likely is not well designed to find them. It really is the goal is to search, to seek, and to destroy. So you should expect to find some occasional positives. Now, having said that, if you have more than the occasional, if you have daily, weekly, multiple hits, that's going to be an issue with the FDA as well. So it really comes back to how robust is your program, and are you actively seeking to destroy, to find the sources and then to destroy them with good, solid corrective actions. Again, it's really about how well are you managing the program, how well are you finding those, and then more importantly, how well are you eradicating those from your facility. You know, it's not 0. That's not realistic. I don't believe the FDA expects to see 0s. In fact, they would probably challenge you that your program is not robust enough if they find no positives whatsoever, especially in a facility with a product mix and an environment that would support Listeria survival and growth. So I don't know that there's an exact answer that 1's okay or 4's okay or 10's okay. It really, a large part comes back to the history of your facility. What have you found in the past? How robust is your program? Do you have really good corrective actions to try and seek and find and destroy? And then how well do you manage that? And that includes some other pieces like trending and tracking and obviously taking a very aggressive action once you do find positives to make sure that you can eliminate them from your environment. So again, 0 is certainly the goal. That's not a complete realistic goal. You will find some positives, absolutely. You should find some positives, and if not, you need to reevaluate your program and see if there are other sites that you should be selecting versus the ones you're currently selecting.
Okay, great. Thanks, Randy. Just curious, and there was a quick question there was just in regards to in evaluation. So when you say occasional, I know when you talk daily, monthly, or whatever else, but is there a recommended time frame of when a program should be evaluated? Seeing if there's gaps or if it's the level it needs to be.
If you have an established program, more commonly from my experience, you would reevaluate your program at least annually. And you would look to see historically where have I had negatives, and historically where should I be looking in additional places, and to change out some of those that you've never seen anything for maybe 2 years, 3 years. Then you start looking for new sites. But that's an ongoing program. For example, if you were to get a positive in an area that you haven't had one historically, then you might want to expand that area and start searching for that source and where that came from. But typically, as I said, if you've got a good, robust program, at least an annual review where you start looking at where are my hotspots, did that change from my past history, or are there areas that I'm not swabbing that I can now look to include in the program that I haven't looked previously.
Okay, great. Thank you, Randy. It sounds absolutely an ongoing path. Well, let's move ahead and move on to our next question. And Peyman, I'll bring you back in here. What are the best practices for Zone 1 swabbing in a closed system?
That's a good question. And not an easy one to answer, because I think there were some suggestions that, well, can we take the first product or some subsequent products coming out of the system in a closed system as an indicator of the effectiveness of the sanitation program or the cleanliness of the closed system. I think my take, and I'd like to get Randy's take on this as well, because he is the absolute expert in this, is identifying or determining the effectiveness of a CIP, essentially closed clean in place system, should be multiphasic in that, yes, you have a chemical regimen program that you send through the system to clean it, but you also should take a look at various points, the fittings, the valves, areas within the system that you may want to actually consider opening up and swabbing after a sanitation cycle. And I say that because you may not actually get everything cleaned up. You know, you may have a bit of a bad weld or a dead leg that could accumulate products and organisms and over time begin to seep into the product that may not show up if you just test the final rinse water or any product that may come out of the system after the start of the production and at some point downstream or a few hours in. So, of course, if you open the system, it requires you to re-clean it, and so that's not something that can be done regularly, but to verify that your sanitation program is working, which is, I think, where this question is essentially going, I would say with some frequency, take a look inside the system, open it up, swab it, and just make sure that you're not in those potentially difficult to clean areas. And we know that there are going to be points within the system that are a little bit more vulnerable than the other parts. And take a swab of those systems, because the product itself or the rinse water or anything that exits the closed system, things may get diluted and it's going to be inconsistent and may not be truly reflective of what's going on inside the system. So I would say it's multi-phase, kind of verify through occasional opening the system, taking a look, closing and re-cleaning it, but do also take samples of the product coming out as well. I mean, that can be used, but I don't think standalone as just managing the product coming out of the system is enough. So obviously sanitary design, the proper chemicals, the flow rates, the time and temperature requirements, the conditions, all of that go into considerations into ensuring you have a effective cleaning program in a closed system. But verification activities could be done and should be done in a multi-phasic system where you're not only evaluating perhaps the rinse water and the product coming, but also occasionally going into the system and swabbing within potential vulnerable areas. Randy, what do you think about this?
Well, I agree. I absolutely agree. And in fact, in my past lives, I've had many closed systems and CIP systems and have actually implemented those sanitation effectiveness checks where we break systems down on a scheduled frequency. You're right. It's multiple pieces that fit into this system, from maintaining spray balls and how often do you check them, because many times spray balls get plugged with gasket material, what have you, and no one looks at them, which means you're not getting effective cleaning in some areas. As an example, gaskets, another area that tend to break down, and we don't always change those out when we should. And you get niche areas where Listeria or other organisms can survive and grow and then be a seed to the product going by. Absolutely, I would recommend that. Areas, as Peyman talked about, where you get gauges and potential, dead ends, where you don't have good flow rates in some areas. Valves historically have been problematic. Just a variety of areas, and if you know your system with a CIP process, then you start to look for those areas that could be problematic, and you focus on those first. And yes, that is a disruption to operations. because not only are you taking valves apart or equipment apart, you also then must re-clean afterwards. So it is a downtime period. But ideally, you can schedule that in to break down your system on some frequency that would not impact operations, too negatively. But absolutely, I believe that is a practice that should be instituted. The other watch out, which I've experienced over time, is control over your program logic. Many companies have people who can write ladder logic or PLC logic and can change programs. And I found many times when sanitation occurs commonly at third shift or overnight, there's not as many resources, there's not as much oversight, and sometimes programming gets changed because I had this issue with logic and the system didn't function the way it should. Somebody changes that and doesn't document it. And then you have a program on paper that's not at all what your system is doing. So that's another piece that I highly recommend is change management on all your logic. And when there are changes, that you verify and then validate the effectiveness of it so that if I change, valve A, that doesn't have an impact somewhere downstream and something else now is not cleaning effectively. But absolutely, it's a multi-phased approach.
Okay, great. No, thank you. It's interesting when we talk about CIPs, we talk about that quite a bit within safety chain because of our optimization solution, and the part about having that data, that analytics, is really important, I would assume, so you could see sort of the cadence of numbers that are coming in, right? So it's interesting. Thank you for that. We'll go ahead and move on to the next question here, and Randy, I'll ask you to go ahead and address it. The question was, let's say I follow FDA's recommendation to test raw materials or Listeria. Do my test results impact other food manufacturers who receive the same lot of raw materials?
Sure. This is a good question, and this is one that industry has struggled with to some extent over many, many years, at least that I've been in industry. So the guidance document really talks to understanding your suppliers and vetting your suppliers so that you have a written program to make sure that you know what the suppliers are doing, how they're controlling risk, how they're controlling Listeria. The testing piece of that is recommended, but that's an overcheck system if you really understand your supplier and know they're managing the risk. So that, I believe, is really more what, and it's just verification, again, that your supplier controls are adequate. But I think that's more appropriate, is doing some overchecking, doing some testing, and just verifying that the COA that you received is accurate, verifying that there are no issues. Always remember that testing is not 100%. It just depends on where that sample came from as to whether you'll find contamination or not. So that's one of the negatives for testing. However, it is a good additional verification step. So the key pieces are, again, having written supplier approval programs, auditing that facility, especially if they're supplying high-risk ingredients to your facility. And high risk, in my definition, is a pathogen can either survive or grow in that product. Understanding COAs, making sure the test results are accurate and within where they should be, and the methods that are utilized for those tests. And then a history, having a history on your supplier, again, working with them ongoing. What past issues have they had? What do your overcheck tests tell you about that supplier? And is that the supplier that is giving you pathogen-free product? If not, then you need to look, obviously, at other suppliers. So the second part of this question is that the risk today, while could be marginally higher from the Listeria guidance document if people start testing more, that may drive the risk higher, but it's pretty much the same risk as today. So for example, if I'm company A and I get a lot of ingredients and I test it and find a positive, my requirement is to fill out an RFR. And if I do that, that means that company X may have that same lot of material. So they are at risk. And if they haven't done testing or if they haven't found positives, that product is suspect for recall. So that risk remains, in my mind, pretty much the same as it is today. Again, that may marginally increase if more people do testing, but the risk is pretty much the same. And in my past companies for which I've worked, where we've had multiple plants using the same ingredients, the same lots, in many cases, to make the same products, we implemented, and many companies have, a database that said when the lot arrives, whoever receives that lot first will do the testing and then document that testing, but no other facility that receives the same lot will do that test. And that's to try and mitigate some of that risk. Again, testing is not 100%, but in the past, that's the way companies have managed it, to try and prevent just that, where you might get a false positive from one site and get a negative at another site. That still says you have a positive. That still implicates product. So that's the way many companies have managed it to this point. It's not 100%, and again, that's why testing, yes, it's a key verification tool that you have and an overcheck tool that I absolutely recommend you do. But the key here is going back and knowing your suppliers, understanding their controls, understanding the culture and their programs, and making sure that you're selecting good suppliers and not those with a history of poor performance over the past. And Peyman, please weigh in if you have other comments.
No, Randy, I 100% agree with you. This kind of brings me to some of the situations that you and I together have dealt with within some of our clients, is that it goes back into supplier verification and managing the supply chain, understanding who is managing the risk here, and are they managing the right risk and or taking a right hazard analysis, where you may be testing as a buyer, the customer of your supplier for Listeria, whereas your supplier itself may be focused in other organisms because the product may be not commonly associated with Listeria, but because of your product, your, these are specific situations that that's where your focus is, and you find it. All of a sudden, your suppliers and their other customers get implicated and pulled into this as well. So yes, other manufacturers do indeed are impacted, and it goes back into having a very robust supplier program and a clear plan to manage it within the organization, as Randy mentioned. Who does the testing, and where do other facilities within that same organization, or if you're just a single facility, how well are you going to make sure that your expectations from your suppliers are met and the results are communicated, because it does indeed, if it's shared with other manufacturers, it will impact them for sure.
Okay, great, thank you. And I think it's interesting, Randy, when you pointed out again, if there's a supplier that had zero test results, that's also for suspect, based on what we were discussing earlier. Moving on.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, I'm moving on. I guess. Thank you for that. To one of our last pre-submitted questions, I do see a whole host of questions coming in as well, and we'll do our best to get through them. Peyman, go ahead and share with us that the guidance gives specific recommendations for third-party lab accreditation as a qualification to perform the test for Listeria. Can an in-house lab meet equivalent standards to demonstrate that they are qualified to perform the test?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think from my perspective, the guidance took a small step forward towards bringing in-house labs or organizational corporate level labs along the accreditation path, in that they actually, in the guidance document, they recognize ISO 17025, which is essentially the accreditation guide for all labs. And most third-party labs are, I think as far as my experience has been, have gone through that accreditation. And it is one that I think should be required if you're sending your samples out to a third-party lab to do the testing for you, because you want to make sure that their results are dependable, credible, defensible, and that you can make the right decision to make a decision on your product. At the same time, the methodology needs to be scientifically valid. So the method itself has gone through external validation to ensure that it's fit for the purpose. For in-house labs, and the FSMA guidance, the FSMA rules are actually vague about this, that they don't particularly require in-house labs yet to be an accredited laboratory. However, as part of the practice within the company, without perhaps going at the accreditation, you can use the guidance provided with 17025 to gauge how well the quality management system within the lab is performing to ensure the results are dependable, and buying the methods, the test kits from manufacturers that have gone through external validation, AOAC or otherwise other accreditation bodies that do accredit the methods and validate the methods. So to answer the question, an in-house lab can meet the equivalent standards, and they should do all they can to ensure the results that they depend on are, are defensible and dependable. So they can go through the documentation and documentation management, data management, environmental management of the lab requirements that would be as part of a 17025 accreditations, perhaps short of actually getting accreditation, but knowing that FDA is also looking at downstream decision on requiring all laboratories to eventually get accreditation. I think that's probably the direction things are headed. Obviously, we have no timeline on that and don't know when and how, but the expectation is that it will eventually include in-house labs as well. So the earlier the labs and the companies get started on that, certainly the better.
Okay, great, thank you. I know that question came up, I think, a few times. I'm glad that we're able to address that here today. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and open this up to some of the questions that have come in. If anyone has questions, go ahead and submit them. It looks like we are at the bottom of the hour. A few people have chatted to say that they have to log off. So just a few quick notes before people who have to leave, and then for those who can stay on for about 10 more minutes, and we'll try to get through a good few of the questions. Just a little plug, as always, for the Acheson Group. Their depth and breadth of services to help companies and the consulting organization. And always, I defer people to their website. I know that when guidance documents come out, that you all, they list them and have links for them as well. And I love the blog posts. That's always a conversation. All your different blogs that come out, Peyman, Randy, on different topics, they always make their rounds of safety chain as well. So I encourage everyone to sign up for that. And then also just a little plug as far as safety chain and our food safety and quality management solutions and helping FSMA compliance. And one thing, as I mentioned earlier, our newer CIP optimization tool, I think is interesting just in regards to what we're talking about as far as really having the data you need to figure out when things are not quite where they should be and be able to pinpoint that. But again, our host of solutions are real time to help manage compliance and just everyday execution of your programs. Also, one thing I did quickly want to mention is we did launch with the Acheson Group, FSMA Friday's LinkedIn group. It's fairly new. You should have gotten a link or invitation. If not, you could just search it LinkedIn. But what our plan is to do with this is for questions we didn't get to, we intend to post a few throughout the month and some answers, as well as some of the questions that came in and were answered after the bottom of the hour. So for those that had to log off, that's a good source. And then just in general, we're hoping to create an interactive group that's really just about FSMA. It's not meant to be a public advertising site, if you will. We're really hoping to keep it the dialogue going amongst the peers that are on FSMA Fridays. So do encourage folks to join us for that. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and answer, or I should say, throw out a couple questions to our tag team online with us today. A couple questions here that did come in. Let me open this up here. Well, here's just a general one, but I think it's interesting. Is Listeria the #1 foodborne health risk? I don't know who wants to grab that one, but it's a good general
maybe
question.
I'll start with that. Listeria, in terms of health impact, has been associated with probably largest number of foodborne illnesses and deaths associated with it. However, Salmonella and Campylobacter have higher incidences of recalls and contaminations than Listeria, but the infectious dose and illnesses and deaths associated with Listeria tends to be higher. But in terms of the number one health risk, I would say no, but it's one that impacts greater number of the elderly, the children, pregnant women, those with the immune compromised system are impacted, and we've had a number of cases in the recent years that involve those. So they tend to be in that way. And then, you know, foodborne pathogens in general are essentially, or, you know, there's a more susceptible population there that's impacted, but Listeria specifically in refrigerated ready-to-eat foods has been associated with a large number of illnesses and outbreaks, and which is why kind of FDA and to some degree USDA as well have kind of focused their attention using next-generation sequencing, the whole genome sequencing methods to track and identify the roots and incidences and recalls. But that has since expanded into Salmonella, Campi, E. coli as well. So, but it all depends on the product you make as well. You know, if if Listeria is a known risk within it, then that for you that is the number one health hazard to manage.
Right.
So, a tough one to answer. Randy, did you want to add anything there?
No, I think you described it very well. You know, Listeria absolutely is a concern, both from raw material supply and, more importantly, if you're in a facility with ingredients, with products that are known to be have Listeria contamination, and you have a wet and or refrigerated facility, then obviously that becomes a high focus for your facility. If you're in a dry manufacturing environment, that risk probably is much less, and maybe more Salmonella is what you're looking at. So to Peyton's point, it's really, a lot of it is product specific in addition to the ingredients inbound.
Okay, well, I think this might be a good follow-up question, Zach, in regards to ingredients, if you will, and raw agricultural commodities. And the question is, you know, which ones have the greatest risk of Listeria contamination? And again, I'm not sure there's a right answer here, but you know, the question was, is it cantaloupes, leafy greens? I don't know if there's really a way to pinpoint which ones have the greatest risk when it comes to the raw agricultural commodities.
I'll start this out and let Peyman finish it up, I'm sure. But
okay.
It is a difficult question to answer. I mean, any agricultural product that may or may not come in contact with environment and soil, it has a potential risk. And then to compound that, if you have wet processing of that agricultural product, either before you receive it or in your facility, that then elevates that risk to some extent, and even more so if you have refrigerated conditions. So in my mind, it's tough to say, yes, this is the most, or the highest risk product. But in general, you know, agricultural products, wet processing, refrigeration, all of those things tend to point to potential risks that you need to manage. And Peyman, I'll let you weigh in.
I agree with you, Randy, and that is a tough one. And I think what we have to also consider is field practices and how that product and conditions that product was grown and handled and harvested and transported up to the point that required all the additional refrigeration and handling. And the data around field contamination, which is essentially where most of the contamination comes from, is kind of all over the place. There's clearly, you know, best practices that that have to be taken into account, field inputs, employee, harvesting equipment, all of that, the regionality, the culture where the product comes from, all of that impacts the risk. So if a product grown in the same product grown in two different environments with two different sets of risk factors could have different risks. So we can't say cantaloupe or make, it's difficult to just make a category or commodity specific determination, but have to take a lot into account in terms of how that product is going to be managed and processed, further processed. Is it cut, washed, the sanitation design, the GMP conditions of that particular product downstream, and ultimately the consumer use of it as well. So very difficult one. Again, I hate to say, but it depends on a lot. And essentially, I think if you're a supplier or a manufacturer, you have to take into account where the product's coming from and how you're managing it, and ultimately how your customers and the consumers are managing it as well. But there is a lot to take into consideration when answering a question like this. I hope that at least we shed some light into it.
Well, I think it bodes with what you always say in every discussion we have on FSMA Fridays when it comes down to really your program and how robust is it and where the gaps, regardless of what you're producing. Would that be a fair statement?
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
And to a large extent, I'm sorry, just to follow up, to a large extent, a previous discussion that we had today, knowing your suppliers, and trying to prevent that from coming into your facility to begin with. And so that drives you to have a high focus on vetting your suppliers, understanding their programs, their culture, their GMPs, and their processing to try and manage that risk before it arrives in your facility.
Absolutely, and keeping track of that on a regular basis. Thank you for that. I think I'm going to sneak in one more question, gentlemen, if that's okay, and then whatever we didn't get to, we'll try to post onto our FSMA Fridays LinkedIn group or bring up our next FSMA Fridays in April, already in March here. Last question for the day. Is the DNA of Wisteria always going to be specific to the facility? And it's asking because of whole genome sequencing and the PulseNet database and the stored DNA profiles they have there.
Maybe I'll take a stab at it, Randy, and I'm sure love to get your take on this, but not necessarily. It depends on the source of the organism. If the organism coming in from a field, and that's essentially where most of the sources are, it could be transient, meaning it can come with the product, and then the sanitation program and the GMPs take care of it. And it goes away, and then it may come in again at some point. But if you have an effective program in place, you tend to manage it and avoid it becoming a resident organism. However, when it does become a resident organism, then it could be that it stays there a long time, and there have been a number of recalls or expanded recalls because of it, because companies have shown that they just couldn't get rid of the organism, either due to poor design, poor sanitation, facility, employee hygiene, all of the risk factors that have been identified. And so at that point, it does become potentially a unique strain, although if that same, let's say, product goes to another facility and established residence, now you have matching potential DNA sequences that can be linked, and one of them could potentially be linked to an outbreak or a recall. So it doesn't, not necessarily. Listeria is ubiquitous. It travels around a number of sources, and that it could get into the facility. It's how well you're able to prevent it from establishing residents that are at the facility. The facility design, the equipment, the sanitation program, the employee hygiene, the flow, all of the factors that we just talked about play a role into keeping the organism from establishing. And if it gets in there, it just becomes a transient one and doesn't, stay there. So that's essentially whether it's a resident or a transient one. DNA, DNA is a unique fingerprint essentially for a pathogen, just like human fingerprints are. So there is a certain region of the DNA that's conserved and similar within all Listeria monocytogenes as well. But there are differences that uniquely differentiate a strain from another. So one that's identified at company X at Listeria monocytogenes will not be the same as, or could be, but in most cases will not be the same as another Listeria that is found in another company states away or maybe down the road. So a lot depends on this, where it's coming from and how well it's managed when it gets into the facility.
Okay, great. Thank you. Randy, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, I think Peyman covered that very well. Once it gets residency, that's when, yes, they can track back to facility, and it typically would be a unique strain to that facility. But as Peyman said, if it's transient, if it comes in and your programs and your equipment and your culture and your GMPs manage it, eliminate it, then the risk is obviously much, much lower. But to Peyman's point, it could be the exact same strain if the ingredient or the product were sent to two different companies, two different facilities. It's really then how do you eliminate it once it's there and prevent it from becoming resident. So I absolutely agree with Peyman's comments.
Okay, great. Thank you. And with that, we always threaten to keep these sessions on time, but again, the goal here is to keep the interaction going. So thank you, both Peyman and Randy, for speaking with us and answering a good few of these questions that came in, as well as to our audience. Quite a few members still online here. We did not get to your question. We do have that recorded, and we'll do our best to address them in the FSMA Fridays LinkedIn group and or bring them up on the next session, which is end of April 28th. Also, I know this topic is certainly dialogue of conversations of topics at the various shows, and quite a few coming up, Safety Chain, and I know TAG as well. DRC, there's an AMI show coming up that we'll be at. Something not on here, and we're talking a lot about produce, and I do know this topic will be up in that conversation. The PMA is having an event coming up here in a few weeks as well. And then certainly Food Safety Summit and IFP, I know both organizations will be there, and we'll look forward to seeing everyone. So with that, thank you so much, Peyman and Randy. You've been initiated officially into FSMA Fridays Club.
Thank you. Great to be with you again, Jill.
Really,
and thank you, everybody.
Yeah, and I really appreciate it. Before we were online here, I'll share with the group that, the Acheson Group and both Randy and Peyman are just tireless in their helping customers and traveling. So I'm glad that you both were able to join us today and share the dialogue and the depth and breadth of the answers. So thank you so much.
Our pleasure.
You're very welcome.
Okay. Happy FSMA Fridays to everyone, and we'll see you online April 28th. Have a good day.